Lyra stood at the observation point overlooking the vast nutrient fields that stretched across the valley of Vextra Prime. Her silver skin reflected the light of the twin suns, creating patterns that danced across the crystalline rock beneath her feet. She had come here every morning for the past week, hoping to see some sign of recovery in the crops. But each day brought more disappointment. The fields remained barren and lifeless, scorched by the unusual heat that had swept across their world without warning. She was not alone in her worry. Throughout the entire settlement, every Vextran carried the weight of the same fear. The harvest failure had come suddenly, brought by a climate shift that their scientists could not fully explain. The temperature had risen by 30 degrees in just 2 cycles. The protein colonies that formed the basis of their food supply had begun to die almost immediately. Within weeks, the cultivated gardens that fed thousands had become nothing more than desiccated remains. Mara found her sister standing in her usual spot. The younger Vextran moved with the easy grace that came naturally to those of her generation. Her skin still held the golden sheen that Lyra remembered from their childhood, before responsibility and worry had begun to dull her own coloring. Mara carried a small container with her, and Lyra could smell the faint aroma of the evening meal rations. Their mother had died many cycles ago during a medical procedure that failed. Their father had chosen the path of dissolution 10 seasons before that, when his body could no longer sustain itself through work. Now it was just the two of them. Lyra, who worked in the Great Archive preserving the knowledge and culture of their people. Mara, who spent her time creating art and sculpture that brought moments of beauty to their struggling community. They had only each other, and that bond had become stronger and more precious with each passing cycle. Lyra looked at the food container and felt her heart constrict. She knew exactly how small the ration portions had become. She knew that Mara had been receiving slightly larger portions at the central distribution point because the council had designated younger individuals as priority for continued survival. The policy made logical sense. Children and young adults had more potential cycles ahead of them. Their continued existence would benefit the species more than the survival of older individuals. But logic could not comfort Lyra as she watched her sister. Mara was only 16 cycles old. Her entire existence was still ahead of her. She had barely begun to explore her artistic talents. She had never experienced the deeper connections that came with maturity and understanding. She had never fallen into love or created something truly magnificent. All of that potential could vanish if the food crisis continued. They ate their meal together in silence, sitting on the smooth stone that had been warmed by the twin suns. Lyra noticed that Mara ate slowly, savoring each bite with an intensity that spoke of hunger not yet satisfied. In previous cycles before the crisis, their people had enjoyed abundant meals. They had celebrated with feasts that lasted entire evenings. They had wasted food without thinking, secure in the knowledge that the harvests would always provide more. Those days seemed like they belonged to a different world entirely. After they finished eating, Mara spoke about her latest sculpture project. She was creating something that represented the concept of hope, she explained. It would be carved from the pale stone that came from the deep caverns beneath their settlement. She wanted to capture the feeling of light breaking through darkness, of something beautiful emerging from nothing. She talked about her vision with an enthusiasm that made Lyra's chest ache. Lyra listened and smiled, encouraging her sister to continue describing every detail. But in the back of her mind, a terrible thought was taking shape. A thought that grew stronger and more insistent with each passing day, as the food situation worsened. The council had held a meeting 3 days ago. Lyra had attended as she did for all official gatherings. The news they shared had been devastating. Their projections showed that the food supplies would sustain approximately 40% of the current population for 6 months if they implemented strict rationing. After that, mass starvation would become inevitable. The council was forced to make a choice that no governing body should ever have to make. They announced that all citizens would participate in a voluntary dissolution program. Those who felt they had lived full lives were encouraged to accept peaceful termination. Those who were willing would be given the opportunity to step aside and allow others to survive. It was presented as a choice. It was framed as mercy, but everyone understood what it really meant. The council was asking people to die so that others might live. Lyra had listened to the proposal with growing horror. She had watched as the elder members of the council spoke about population management and resource allocation, as though they were discussing numbers on a ledger rather than actual lives. She had seen the pain in their eyes as they realized the weight of what they were proposing. These were good people making impossible decisions, but there had to be another way. There had to be something more that could be done. As Mara described the exact curves and angles she wanted to carve into her sculpture, Lyra made a decision that would change everything. She would not allow her sister to face the dissolution choice. She would not allow the potential that burned so brightly in Mara to be extinguished. And she had realized there was a way to ensure that. She could reduce her own food intake to minimal survival levels, just enough to maintain basic bodily functions, just enough to keep herself alive but weakened. And she could give her portions to Mara, telling no one. Her sister would eat more. Her sister would remain healthy and strong. Her sister would survive whatever came next. It was a path that would slowly diminish Lyra herself. It was a choice that would require her to watch herself fade away, cycle after cycle, as her body consumed its own reserves. It would be painful and difficult and lonely, but Mara would live. Mara would continue to create beauty. Mara would carry forward the light of Vextran culture into whatever future awaited them. Lyra had already begun the process. For the past week, she had taken her meal rations and eaten only tiny portions. The rest she had hidden in a secure location, mixing it carefully into Mara's own portions when her sister was not paying attention. She had been weakening noticeably, but she had covered it by claiming an old illness was returning. She told people at the archive that she was tired from increased work demands. She moved more slowly and deliberately, blaming it on the heat. Mara had not yet noticed, or if she had not said anything. She simply continued with her life, creating her art, speaking her dreams, being the beautiful young person that Lyra had always known her to be. As the twin suns began to set, painting the sky in shades of purple and deep blue, Lyra held her sister close. She did not tell her what she was doing. She did not explain the sacrifice that she had already begun. Some choices, she believed, were meant to be made alone. Some acts of love were most pure when they remained unspoken. 7 weeks had passed since Lyra began her quiet sacrifice. The changes in her body were becoming increasingly difficult to hide. Her skin, once a vibrant silver with traces of gold that ran through it like precious metal, had taken on a pale gray coloring that was starting to match the stone of their settlement. Her movements had become slower and more deliberate. Where once she could move through the archive with quick efficiency, now each task required careful planning and extended rest periods. The work at the archive continued, though the focus had changed considerably. Instead of adding new materials and organizing new information, the archivists now spent most of their time maintaining the existing collections and preserving the historical records of their people. Lyra found a strange comfort in this work. Even as her body weakened, her mind remained sharp. She could still understand the intricate organizational systems. She could still help younger archivists learn the proper methods of preservation. Her physical strength might be fading, but her knowledge and experience remained valuable. Her colleague Diane had begun to notice the changes. Diane was older than Lyra, with skin that had taken on the pale coloring that came with age. She had worked alongside Lyra in the archive for nearly 30 cycles, and she knew her well. One afternoon, as Lyra rested on the main reading platform, Diane approached her with obvious concern etched across her features. Diane asked if Lyra was unwell. She pointed out that her friend seemed to be deteriorating rapidly. She suggested that perhaps Lyra should visit the medical facility for an evaluation. There might be something they could do to help. Lyra created a story about an old illness that came from her childhood. She explained that it sometimes resurged during periods of stress or when the weather patterns shifted. She assured Diane that it was nothing serious, just something she had learned to live with. The lie came smoothly, and Diane seemed to accept it, though her expression remained troubled. Meanwhile, the food situation throughout the settlement continued to worsen. The council had begun to implement the voluntary dissolution program. Each day, older Vextrans would make their way to the medical facility and choose to accept peaceful termination. It was not presented as a tragedy, but rather as a dignified choice, a way for those who had lived full lives to contribute one final time to the survival of their species. The number of participants was lower than the council had projected. Many of the elderly refused to participate. They chose instead to continue living on reduced rations, hoping that conditions would improve. Others argued that the young should be encouraged to accept the dissolution choice, not the old. Why should experience and wisdom be lost when potential remained ahead? The council did not force anyone. They could not. The Vextran culture was built on the concept of individual choice and dignity, but the underlying pressure remained constant. Those who chose to continue living existed in the knowledge that their survival meant someone else's suffering. That knowledge became heavier with each passing day. Mara thrived during this period, though she seemed unaware of exactly why. She had grown stronger and healthier. Her artistic work had become increasingly refined and sophisticated. She had completed her sculpture of hope, and it was beautiful beyond anything she had previously created. The pale stone had been shaped into an almost liquid form, with light and shadow playing across its surface in ways that made viewers feel as though they were witnessing something holy and profound. The sculpture had been displayed in the central gathering space, and Vextrans came from across the settlement to view it. They stood before it in silence, allowing its form to speak to something deep within their consciousness. Here was beauty. Here was proof that even during a time of crisis and fear, their people could still create something that nourished the spirit. Mara had given them a gift at a moment when gifts seemed impossible. Lyra had attended the viewing of the sculpture on its opening day. She stood before her sister's creation and felt tears flowing down her face. The effort of standing for that long had exhausted her completely, but she remained there until the very end. She wanted to absorb every detail of what Mara had created. She wanted to carry the memory of this moment for as long as her body continued to function. Mara had found her in the crowd and embraced her with obvious joy. She kept saying that none of this would have been possible without Lyra's support and encouragement. She said that her sister had always believed in her, even when the world was falling apart around them. She said that Lyra's faith in her potential had sustained her through moments of doubt. Lyra had smiled and held her sister close, but she could not speak. If she had tried to form words in that moment, the truth of what she was doing would have poured out of her. She would have told Mara everything. She would have explained the sacrifice that was slowly consuming her body and her strength, and she could not allow that to happen. Mara deserved to remain in the joy of this moment without the weight of her sister's suffering pressing down upon her. That night, Lyra could barely eat even the small portions she had been consuming. Her body was reaching the limit of how much it could sustain on minimal nutrition. She had begun to notice internal changes as well. Her vision sometimes blurred. Her thoughts occasionally became sluggish and difficult to organize. She understood that she was approaching a critical threshold. Her body could not continue at this level of deprivation for much longer. She estimated she had perhaps another 4 to 6 weeks before her body would begin to fail, more obviously. She had hoped that something would change by then. Perhaps the council would find new food sources. Perhaps other settlements would be able to provide aid. Perhaps some solution would emerge that would allow both her and Mara to survive. But Lyra was not holding her breath for miracles. She had made her choice, and she would see it through to its conclusion. As long as Mara survived and continued to create beauty, that would be enough. As long as her sister's light continued to shine, Lyra's sacrifice would have meaning. She lay in her sleeping chamber that night, feeling the weakness in her bones and the slowness in her heartbeat. She thought about all the cycles she had lived, all the experiences she had gathered, all the knowledge she had accumulated. She thought about the life that Mara still had ahead of her, all the possibilities waiting to be discovered and explored, and she felt at peace with her choice. In the darkness, listening to the sounds of the settlement around her, Lyra waited for whatever would come next. The signal came through the communication array on a day when Lyra thought she might not be able to return to work at all. She had woken that morning barely able to move. Her muscles had weakened to the point where standing required intense concentration and careful balance. Her skin had become almost translucent in places, revealing the network of vessels beneath the surface. She had considered simply not going to the archive that day, but the thought of lying in her chamber, alone with her deteriorating body and her thoughts, seemed even more unbearable. So she had pulled herself up. She had dressed in her work clothing. She had made her way slowly through the corridors of the settlement, moving like someone far older than her actual cycles. Her colleagues at the archive had tried to send her home, but she insisted on staying. She needed the work. She needed the purpose. Without it, she thought she might lose herself entirely. The alert sounded in the early afternoon. The communication array, maintained by their most skilled technical specialists, had detected an incoming signal from outside their system. The announcement went out across the entire settlement through the internal communication network. Every Vextran heard the news almost simultaneously. An external contact was approaching. A vessel from another civilization was preparing to enter their atmosphere. The settlement erupted into a mixture of panic and excitement. Some Vextrans feared contact with unknown species. Others saw the arrival of visitors as a potential solution to their food crisis. Perhaps these outsiders would offer aid. Perhaps they would bring solutions that the Vextrans had not yet discovered. The council called for an immediate assembly in the central gathering space. Lyra made her way there slowly, her body protesting each movement. The chamber filled with hundreds of Vextrans all speaking at once, sharing their fears and hopes and theories about who these visitors might be. Kesh, the eldest member of the council, stood at the front of the chamber. His skin had taken on the pale gray that marked extreme age among their people. He was one of the few individuals who had chosen not to pursue the dissolution option, despite clearly having lived a long and full life. He raised his hands for silence and began to speak. He told the assembled crowd that the incoming vessel had identified itself as the Discovery, a human spacecraft from a planet called Earth. The humans were a species that had recently achieved faster-than-light travel capability. They claimed to be explorers interested in establishing peaceful contact with other civilizations. Their message was simple and direct. They requested permission to land and establish diplomatic relations. The reaction to this news varied greatly among those gathered. Some Vextrans seemed relieved that the visitors claimed peaceful intentions. Others expressed skepticism about the reliability of such promises. A few individuals voiced concern that contact with an unknown species might bring disease or hostile intent despite their stated peaceful purposes. Kesh explained that the council had decided to invite the humans to land. He argued that isolation had not served their people well. Contact with another species might bring new knowledge and potentially new resources. The council believed that the risk was worth taking, given their current circumstances. Lyra stood at the back of the chamber and listened to all of this with a strange sense of detachment. She was so weakened now that the words seemed to come to her from a great distance. She could understand them intellectually, but emotionally they felt almost irrelevant. She was focused entirely on maintaining her physical form upright and conscious for as long as possible. Mara found her after the assembly ended. Her sister seemed excited about the arrival of visitors from another world. She had many questions about what these humans might be like and what their civilization might have discovered. She wondered if the visitors would be interested in Vextran art and culture. She asked if Lyra thought the humans would understand the meaning in her sculpture of hope. Lyra tried to engage with her sister's excitement, but she could only manage brief responses. Her voice had become thin and quiet, as though her vocal cords were losing the strength necessary to project sound. She felt Mara watching her with concern but chose not to address it. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Lyra made her way home and collapsed into her sleeping chamber. She had reached the end of what her body could endure. She knew that she had at most another few days before her physical condition would become impossible to conceal. Within a week, perhaps two, her body would simply stop functioning. But Mara would survive that. Mara would have the time she needed to grow and develop and create. The food that Lyra had been giving up for so many weeks had sustained her sister through the worst of the crisis. Now, with the arrival of the humans and the possibility that they might bring resources or solutions, perhaps Mara would have the opportunity to live a full life. That night, as she lay in her chamber barely able to move, Lyra found herself thinking about the strange timing of it all. Just when her sacrifice had reached its breaking point, when she could no longer continue, help was arriving from across the stars. It seemed like the kind of thing that existed only in stories and myths. She did not allow herself to hope too much. Hope was dangerous when you had already accepted your own ending. But she did find herself curious about these humans. What kind of species would travel between stars seeking peaceful contact? What kind of beings would offer help to strangers without guarantee of benefit to themselves? The next morning, she learned that the human shuttle had been cleared to land. Throughout the settlement, individuals were preparing for first contact with an unknown civilization. The council was organizing the official greeting delegation. Scientists were preparing their instruments to study the visitors. Artists were creating welcome presentations to display Vextran culture. Lyra could not have predicted that this contact would change everything. She could not have imagined the specific form that salvation would take. She could only lie in her chamber, her body failing, her spirit still holding on to the knowledge that she had done what needed to be done. She had given her sister a future. That was all that mattered. That would always be enough. Captain Rebecca Martinez stepped out of the shuttle onto the crystalline surface of Vextra Prime. The landscape before her was unlike anything she had encountered during her years of space exploration. Vast formations of translucent crystal rose from the ground like natural structures that might have been deliberately designed by some ancient architect. The twin suns cast overlapping shadows that created patterns of incredible complexity. She could understand why the initial surveys had noted the aesthetic beauty of this world. But the beauty masked something darker. Rebecca had studied the thermal scans during the approach. She had noted the weak energy signatures and the minimal agricultural activity. Something was wrong on this world. The settlement below showed signs of a civilization under severe stress. She was accompanied by a small team of specialists. Catherine was the senior medical officer, a woman with decades of experience in first contact situations. Marcus served as the primary communications specialist, equipped with translation algorithms that should allow for basic conversation once proper language patterns were established. There were security personnel as well, though they remained unobtrusive. First contact protocols emphasized peaceful and open approach. The Vextran delegation that awaited them was impressive. The aliens were tall and graceful, with skin that seemed to shift and shimmer in the light. They moved with a controlled elegance that suggested a civilization with a long history and deep cultural refinement. An elder stepped forward, his skin marked with the pale coloring of advanced age. He extended his hand toward Rebecca in what appeared to be a gesture of peace. Rebecca smiled and mirrored the gesture. The connection between human and Vextran, between two species meeting for the first time, felt momentous. In that simple handshake, bridges were being built across the vast distances of space and experience. The initial communications were carried out through translation devices. The exchange was pleasant and filled with mutual expressions of peaceful intent. Rebecca explained the purpose of the discovery and expressed human interest in establishing friendly relations with the Vextran people. Kesh, as the elder identified himself, welcomed the humans and offered to show them their settlement. As they began the tour, Catherine moved alongside Rebecca and quietly indicated her medical scanner. The reading she was getting did not match the initial atmospheric surveys. Something was definitely wrong with the health patterns in this settlement. There were individuals showing severe malnutrition indicators. While most of the population appeared reasonably healthy, there seemed to be anomalies in specific individuals. Rebecca's attention was drawn to two younger Vextrans who were standing slightly apart from the main group. One of them was obviously in physical distress. Her skin had taken on a sickly gray coloring. Her movements were unstable, as though standing required enormous effort. The other young Vextran, by contrast, appeared to be in excellent health. The contrast between the two was stark and troubling. Catherine was already moving toward them. She began her scans without waiting for permission, her medical training overriding concerns about protocol in the face of obvious health crisis. The readings she received were shocking. The weaker Vextran was in critical condition. Her body was running on the absolute minimum reserves necessary to maintain consciousness and basic function. It was the kind of malnutrition that typically came from extreme starvation over an extended period. Rebecca moved toward Kesh and asked directly about the food situation in their settlement. She asked if they were experiencing some kind of resource difficulty or crisis. The response came slowly, with obvious reluctance and difficulty. Kesh explained that Vextra Prime had suffered an unexpected climate shift 3 months earlier. The environmental change had destroyed the protein colonies that formed the foundation of their food supply. The settlement was currently existing on rationed portions that allowed for survival, but not abundance. The population was facing a genuine crisis in resource availability. Rebecca listened to this explanation and felt the pieces coming together. The weak energy signatures, the minimal agricultural activity, the presence of individuals showing signs of extreme starvation, despite their civilization appearing advanced and organized. This was a species facing a survival crisis of profound dimensions. She turned to look at the two young Vextrans again. She watched as the healthier one reached out and touched the weaker one gently, with obvious affection and concern. That simple gesture told her everything. The weaker Vextran was sacrificing herself so that the other could survive. It was an act of pure love and selflessness made visible. Rebecca had encountered many species during her years of space exploration. She had studied their cultures and their social structures and their values. But this gesture transcended all cultural boundaries. This was something fundamentally universal, a being willing to suffer and diminish itself so that someone it loved could continue to exist. That was the purest expression of what it meant to care about another. Rebecca made a decision in that moment that would alter the course of her future interactions with this species and potentially influence human policy toward the Vextrans for generations to come. She turned to her team and spoke directly. She instructed them to return to the Discovery and begin transferring emergency food supplies from the ship to the Vextran settlement. She authorized the transfer of 50% of their emergency rations. She accepted the risk that they would have reduced supplies for the remainder of their mission. She accepted that she was making a choice that would require justification when she returned to human space. Kesh attempted to refuse this assistance. He argued that it would be unfair for the humans to deplete their own resources. He suggested that perhaps the humans could return once the Vextran crisis had resolved itself. He explained that the Vextrans had learned to manage their situation and would find solutions through their own efforts. Rebecca smiled gently and explained something about human nature. She told Kesh that humanity had learned centuries ago that some things were worth more than the material resources you possessed. She had witnessed an act of sacrifice and love. She had seen a young woman willing to give up everything so that someone she cherished could survive. That demonstration of values and character was worth more than any food calculation. That revealed something essential about the Vextran people. She told Kesh that humanity would not abandon them. The supplies being transferred would sustain the settlement through the worst of the crisis. And when humans returned to this region of space, as they surely would, they would remember the Vextrans not as a species they encountered in passing, but as a people of dignity and deep moral character. Catherine had begun administering medical treatment to the weaker Vextran using human medical technology. The response was immediate. Color began to return to her skin. Her breathing deepened. Her eyes grew clearer and more focused. Mara held her sister's hand and began to cry as she understood what had been happening. She understood the sacrifice. She understood that Lyra had been slowly destroying herself so that her sister could survive. The supply transfer took most of the day. Crate after crate of food and medical supplies were brought from the shuttle to the Vextran settlement. The human crew worked systematically and efficiently, carrying materials that represented their emergency survival rations. Each crate that was placed on the ground was one less resource that the Discovery would have available if their own mission encountered serious difficulty. But Rebecca did not regret the decision for a moment. Catherine remained with Lyra through the entire process of medical treatment. She administered nutrients directly through Lyra's body, using advanced human medical technology. She monitored the Vextran's physical responses and adjusted the treatment protocol as needed. Slowly, gradually, Lyra began to recover from her critical condition. The severe malnutrition that had brought her to the edge of total bodily failure began to be reversed. Her skin began to regain its natural coloring. Her breathing became stronger and more regular. Mara never left her sister's side. She held Lyra's hand and spoke softly about all the things they would do together once Lyra was fully recovered. She talked about showing the humans around the settlement. She talked about introducing them to her sculpture of hope. She talked about the future that they had been given, a future that seemed impossible just hours before. Through it all, Lyra wept. She wept with relief that her sacrifice had not been in vain. She wept with gratitude that her sister would live. She wept with the overwhelming emotion of understanding that somehow, impossibly, salvation had arrived from the stars just when she was reaching the end of her endurance. Rebecca spent time speaking with Kesh and the other council members about the broader situation on Vextra Prime. The elder Vextran explained in detail the climate shift that had caused the crisis. He described the choices the council had been forced to make regarding population management. He discussed the voluntary dissolution program that had been implemented. He spoke with visible pain about the ethical dilemmas that leadership had required him to navigate. Rebecca listened with compassion and without judgment. She understood that these beings had done their best with impossible circumstances. They had not failed their people. They had simply faced a crisis that exceeded what any single civilization could manage alone. She made a proposal to Kesh. She offered to send regular resupply missions to Vextra Prime over the following cycles. She explained that human civilization had resources that could be redirected to support Vextran recovery. She suggested that this could be the beginning of a long-term partnership between the two species. She proposed that the humans could help the Vextrans develop new agricultural systems that would be more resilient to climate variations. Kesh listened to all of this with obvious emotion. He explained that the Vextrans had never been a species comfortable with accepting charity or depending on external assistance. Their culture valued self-sufficiency and independence, but he also acknowledged that pride was a luxury that a civilization facing existential crisis could not easily maintain. He accepted Rebecca's offer with the understanding that this would not be a one-sided relationship. He proposed that the Vextrans would offer their own knowledge and resources in return. He suggested cultural exchanges and knowledge sharing. He spoke about the possibility of future cooperation on various scientific and artistic projects. As the afternoon turned toward evening, Rebecca gathered her team and began to prepare for departure. The supplies had been transferred. Lyra had been stabilized and was resting comfortably under Catherine's continued medical supervision. The initial diplomatic contact had been established successfully. But before Rebecca returned to her shuttle, Lyra asked to speak with her. The Vextran woman was still weakened from her ordeal, but had recovered enough to sit up and communicate clearly. Rebecca approached and waited for Lyra to speak. Lyra thanked the human captain for what she had done. She explained that the gesture of compassion and support had saved her life and protected her sister. She said that this interaction would change how the Vextran people understood themselves and their place in the universe. She said that humans had shown them that sacrifice and love were not weaknesses to be ashamed of, but rather values to be honored and celebrated. She told Rebecca that her actions had revealed something essential about what it meant to be part of a broader galactic community. She said that the Vextrans had learned that other species might understand and honor the choices they made and the values they maintained. She said that this knowledge would sustain her people through whatever challenges lay ahead. Rebecca held Lyra's hand and told her that this moment would change humanity as well. She explained that humans would carry the story of Lyra's sacrifice across the stars. She said that this story would remind her people that compassion and connection transcended species boundaries. She said that meeting the Vextrans had given her hope for what all of galactic civilization could become. Mara embraced Rebecca before she departed. The young Vextran artist expressed her gratitude in simple but powerful terms. She spoke about how her sister's sacrifice and the humans' response had given her a different perspective on existence. She said she would create something new, something that captured this moment of contact and compassion. She promised that whatever she created would be a gift to humanity. Rebecca returned to the shuttle as the twin suns began to set on Vextra Prime. She sat in the command chair and initiated the departure sequence. As the shuttle rose from the surface, she looked back at the settlement below. She thought about everything she had witnessed on this world. She thought about a young woman willing to sacrifice herself for her sister. She thought about an alien, species with values and dignity that matched the highest aspirations of humanity. She thought about the vast universe and all the possibilities it contained for connection and understanding between different peoples and different ways of being. The discovery jumped to light speed the following morning, carrying with it the memory of the first contact with the Vextrans. Rebecca filed her official report, describing the climate crisis and the successful transfer of supplies. She documented the medical assistance provided. She outlined the proposal for ongoing cooperation and cultural exchange. But in her personal log, she wrote something different. She wrote about Lyra's sacrifice and what it meant. She wrote about the moments when different species could come together and recognize something fundamental in each other. She wrote about hope and compassion and the power of one individual's willingness to endure suffering for someone they loved. Years later, when historians would write about first contact with the Vextran people, they would emphasize the diplomatic breakthrough and the establishing of trade relations. But the true significance of that moment lay in something deeper. It lay in the recognition that values like love and sacrifice were universal. It lay in the understanding that consciousness, in whatever form it took, contained the capacity for profound compassion. And as the discovery carried her forward through the stars, Rebecca Martinez carried with her the knowledge that humanity had become something better on that day.